The family that vacations together stays together. At least, that was the plan. Except now, the dastardly desk clerk is saying he can't confirm your connecting rooms.
Wait, what?
That's right, ma'am. You have rooms 201 and 709.
No, we cannot be 5 floors away from our kids.
The doors have double locks. They'll be fine.
When you want connecting rooms confirmed before you arrive, it matters where you stay.
Welcome to Hilton. I see your connecting rooms are already confirmed.
Hilton, for the stay.
Wish you could become a morning person? You know the type, up before the sun, early morning runs, first one to the office with donuts and a smile. How do they do it? Easy. With the new Galaxy Watch 8, sleep tracking and personalized insights from Samsung Health help you improve so you can wake up to a whole new you. One who, dare I say it, skips the snooze? It's possible. Train your sleep with Galaxy Watch 8. Learn more at Samsung.com. Requires compatible Samsung Galaxy phone, Samsung Health app, and Samsung account.
This is Fortune's Wheel, a podcast history of the late Middle Ages, and I'm Jonathan. Your time is your greatest currency, make no mistake, and this fact of life does not go unnoticed by the creators on whom you spend your time, so thank you for spending your time listening and learning along with me on this podcast. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos had a lot to deal with the moment he donned that fancy crown with jewels hanging near his cheeks. This episode is structured just as the title explains. First, we'll see Alexios fulfill all of those promises he made on his rise to the top. Second, we will see Alexios put himself on trial. Yeah, you heard that one right. Then we will see Alexios realize that he didn't really want to rule in the first place. And finally, we look outward and see that there were two dangerous enemies lurking on the edge of Eastern Rome, chomping at the bit to take a bite out of the weakened empire. And if you can believe it, this entire episode takes place between April 4th and mid-May of 1081. There was a lot happening in Alexios I's first month. This is Patreon episode 26, entitled The Book of Alexios, Chapter 6, Appointments, Penance, Delegation, and Threats. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. The thing that separates one regime from another, anywhere in history, any time in history, and with any political system in history, is the restructuring that takes place in the highest halls of power. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos was no different. In fact, one can say that Alexios did things to a much higher degree than many others with regards to the restructuring of his empire. See, on his swift rise to the top, he made promises, like a lot of promises, to those around him, loyalists and otherwise. Over the next few weeks, Alexios would not only shift new people into positions of power, surrounding himself in a bubble of support, but he also made up some new positions as well. The first instance of this comes with his chief rival to the crown, his own brother-in-law, who he'd gotten along with quite well, Nicephorus Melissenus. The letter that he had sat on for a number of days finally reached Melissenus as Alexios was invading the capital of Constantinople and overthrowing Nicephorus III. Self-proclaimed Emperor Melissenus had already offered Alexios joint control in the vein of the old Diocletian, but Alexios outright rejected this idea and counter-offered Melissenus the rank of Caesar, traditionally by this time amounting to second in charge of the whole empire. However, there already was a Caesar when he offered it, which was the longtime power broker and Alexios's great uncle-in-law, John Ducas. Now, John Ducas was tired of it all, and he gave up the title and decided to don the habit of the monk just before the invasion of the capital. This easy bit of negotiation worked out great for Alexios. However, it still hinged on Melissenus even accepting the counteroffer. Thankfully, Melissenus did accept. Alexios I Komnenos now officially had a second in charge in Caesar Nicephorus Melissenus. But this caused another little bit of controversy, as he had promised his own brother, Isaac Komnenos, the role of second in charge, the role of his right-hand man. Well, Alexios was emperor now, so he could do what he wanted, and Alexios decided to create a whole new title for Isaac. It's called Sebastocrator. The Sebastocrator was a combination of the words Sebastos, which means venerable or august, and autocrator, which had been a term used by emperors up to this point because it translated to sole ruler. A Sebastocrator became the title for the venerable second in command, just a half step below co-emperor, if that role even existed, which it did not. But here's the kicker. A Sebastocrator just pushed the Caesar down a rung in the hierarchy. So did Alexios lie to Melissenos? That's the question. Well, no. He promised to make Melissenos the Caesar, not to ensure that he is the second in charge only to the emperor. To quell any possible issues Melissenos might have, Anna Komnene writes, quote, "In addition, Alexios decreed that both Sebastocrator and Caesar should wear crowns at public festivals, although they were much inferior to his own." End quote. On the last episode, we learned what the imperial diadem looked like, but she now describes these crowns, which were identical, which is also interesting. She writes, quote, "The crowns of the Sebastocrator and the Caesar are embellished with few pearls and stones and are not cap-shaped." End quote. So, still bejeweled and an important sign of power and influence, but nothing compared to Alexios' own imperial diadem. As for the very important question of Protovestarius, the male version of someone we met on the last episode, the man who would manage the emperor's daily business and schedules and servants and wardrobes and all of that, was a man named Tyrannades. Now, Tyrannades had married Alexios' sister, Maria Komnene. So the family connection was there, and it was already strong. Alexios clearly trusted Tyrannades with his life, because the Protovestarius had access to the emperor pretty much all times of the day, and for whatever reason. Soon, Tyrannades had the extra title Panhypersebastos added to his title of Protovestarius, which basically elevated not his status on the hierarchy, but his esteem among the topmost officials of the court. Panhypersebastos Protovestarios, Tyrannades, was how he was introduced. And this told people that not only was he a valued and trusted man to the emperor, but he should be treated as such by all who attended court. There was Adrian, Alexios' little brother. He hadn't played much of a role, so he wasn't mentioned, but he was buzzing around in the background of things lately. Well, he was given the honorific Protosebastos Periphanistatos, which wasn't a rank per se, but more of a declaration of status of high value to the emperor. And it was expected they treated him as such. And speaking of brothers, Alexios and Isaac and Adrian had one more little brother, the runt of the litter, who had distinguished himself in naval affairs over the previous few years. His name, not another one. His name was also Nicephorus, but this was Alexios I Komnenos, and he was elevated to a rank known as Megas Drungarios, which was pretty equivalent to an admiral today. This was one of the higher ranks one could achieve in the entire military apparatus, both army and navy, and it seemed well earned and not just a touch of nepotism, though that certainly played a role, as there were undoubtedly other more accomplished and experienced naval officers. Nicephorus Palaiologos, the senior, as we called him on previous episodes, was probably one who had more experience. So, as Anna Komnene herself writes, quote, "My father was responsible for inventing these honors," end quote. But she clarifies something I found interesting, quote, "In the old days, the epithet Sebastos had been applied to emperors only, a distinctive title, but Alexios for the first time allowed it to be more widely used," end quote. You see a shift with Alexios I that wasn't there earlier that year, or before that, for centuries. The shift came in his sharing of honorifics, duties, power, and esteem with those around him. It wasn't the emperor and all the rest, as it had been for so long. It was now the emperor and his hand-picked people who he entrusted and relied upon for good government and imperial management, and by goodness, you should trust him too. That's what it was now. It's small, the shift, but it's there. Alexios, he was just different. Anna explains her father's different approach to governance like this, quote, "If one regards the art of ruling as a science, a kind of supreme philosophy, the art of all arts, so to speak, and the highest science of all, then one would have to admire him as a scientist, in a way, and a leading thinker for having invested these imperial titles and functions. Of course, there was a difference. The great logicians invented names for the sake of lucidity, whereas Alexios, the master of science of government, directed all his innovations toward the good of the empire itself, whether changes were effected in the allotment of duties or in the granting of titles." End quote. Now, obviously, this is heavily biased, as we say about Anna's works. It's also heavily propagandized. But reading what I've read about Alexios, his entire rule, I can see where there's a firm foundation of truth to this. Alexios, again, he just hit different than others had before him. And as you'll see, he wasn't perfect. There were decisions made that we can clearly see were wrong. He wasn't the greatest emperor general in Roman history either, not by far. But he still kept his eye on the prize each and every time, and he did what it took, even taking the massive hits to his personal pride and humility along the way in order to achieve those ends. Now, while Alexios was thumbing through the thesaurus during that first week, he was also juggling the violence in the streets of his capital. Constantinople was burning. It was being looted. Its men and boys were being slaughtered, and unspeakable crimes were happening to its women and girls. Alexios was forced to look on, and being deeply devoted, God-fearing man, he was terrified that these crimes that he had unleashed upon Constantinople would be held against him when he reached the pearly gates. Anna writes, quote, "He grieved and was deeply ashamed at the plundering of the capital, which had taken place when he had occupied it, and which had affected the whole population." End quote. He apparently spent a good amount of his first week as emperor going over all those biblical stories, such as the story of King Saul, who did nothing to put down violence toward his people and only thought about his own fortunes, and how his name might forever become associated with such wicked rulers. Anna continues, quote, "Distraught with these reflections and deeply perturbed, Alexios feared that somehow he might be the scapegoat, the object of God's vengeance. He regarded the evil which had befallen the whole city as his responsibility, even if it was really the work of individual soldiers, all that rabble that descended in a mighty flood on all parts of Constantinople. He was sick at heart, filled with shame, as if he, personally, had committed these frightful atrocities. Majesty and power, the royal purple, and the stone-encrusted diadem, the robe adorned with gold and jewels, all these he quite rightly looked upon as worthless compared with the indescribable disaster that had then afflicted the queen of cities. For no writer, however earnest, could possibly do justice to the terrors by which it was enveloped in those days. Churches, sanctuaries, property both public and private, all were victims of universal pillage, while the ears of all its citizens were deafened by cries and shouts raised on every side. An onlooker might well have thought an earthquake was taking place." End quote. Constantinople, in short, was suffering. She says that Alexios admitted that through this horrible crime wave was the act of individuals and not him. He alone assumed the responsibility. He knew that he had provided the pretext for such things to happen, and therefore he alone would answer to it. But Anna couldn't be too harsh on her beloved father. She had to stick up for him a little bit, so she slyly added, quote unquote, "The true responsibility for the revolt, of course, lay with the slaves I have referred to before." Sneaky, sneaky. And I love her use of course, as if it were a foregone conclusion that the slaves, Germanos and Barilos, were the real ones to blame. There is a touching scene in which we see Alexios going to his mother, Anna Delegation, and unburdening himself with his feelings about the state of Constantinople and what he's allowed to happen. She hugs him and decides to call the patriarch named Cosmas from the Hagia Sophia to help ease the emperor's fears and anxieties and guilt. Cosmas calls together the other leading clergy to the Hagia Sophia, and Alexios appears before them all. Anna writes, quote, "As a man on trial, a person of no account," end quote. It's a curious episode in the larger story, but it shows Alexios I's humility, and I genuinely believe he had a touch of it, unlike pretty much every other ruler in history up to today. Sure, Alexios I was still an emperor, and as such didn't always seek the best way for others, but he stands out as one who did so far more often than other rulers, medieval or not. Anna writes, quote, "He confessed everything, passing over neither the temptation nor the yielding to it, nor the commission of evil, nor even the responsibility for what was done. He admitted all in fear and faith, passionately demanding from them a remedy for his misdeeds and offering to undergo penance," end quote. Alexios I really put himself out there. Let's suppose that Alexios truly was feeling guilt. That would make him exceptional, for sure, in the grand line of world leaders. Not even the popes we've seen so far in the show have behaved with such humility. However, I would like to consider the strategic importance of this move too. Let's suppose for a moment that Alexios was playing a larger game here, and that his daughter, decades later, was running a little propaganda, restructuring that particular episode to fit a better image of her father's early reign. Well, strategically, it's brilliant. As I've said before, and will probably say again, every emperor needed to have the backing of the local clergy for a smooth transition and reign. By prostrating himself at the feet of the patriarch and clergy, Alexios is endearing himself to them in the process. Just something to consider. Now, as for the verdict, one was indeed given. Alexios, as well as his whole family and every single person who contributed to the sack of Constantinople, must submit to 40 days and 40 nights of intense fasting, sleeping on the ground, and the performing of certain rites of appeasement for God so that his anger may subside. All involved gladly participated, as it was a way to cleanse their eternal souls, something that all in the medieval world thought a lot about. Anna even adds, quote, "In fact, their wives could not bear to stand aloof. How could they, when they loved their husbands, and of their own free will they too submitted to the yoke of penance," end quote. Now, in addition to this, Alexios alone chose extra self-flagellation in the form of an incredibly itchy wool sackcloth to be worn for those 40 days and nights under everything he wore, close to his skin, as a constant, scratchy reminder of the horrors he'd inflicted upon the capital. This was the, more or less, the self-inflicted trial Emperor Alexios I decided to begin his reign with, literally in the first couple days. And its public effects were enormous. He, of course, inflicted devastating punishments for crimes committed after a certain date, which was mere days after the initial breach of the wall, and the violence quickly subsided after that. The people were able to get back on their feet, rebuild their homes and businesses, reestablish connections, and resume their daily affairs within a couple weeks. Damage had certainly been done. Physical, property, spiritually, emotionally, morally, it's all there, right? Damage had certainly been done. But in the medieval mind, one must accept the atrocities of life as well as war and move on. And that's what they did. And seeing their new emperor voluntarily pay a price for what befell them did wonders for his public image. Alexios I was quickly forgiven and accepted as everyone was excited about this fresh, young, militarily successful emperor taking the reins. An emperor who would take the blame for things that weren't even his fault. Nice change of pace. Now let's switch gears here, having just seen the precedent that Alexios I would set for all emperors after him, setting a pretty humble tone going forward. But was he really the brains behind the whole operation? John Carr, in his book The Komneni Dynasty, writes, quote, "Anna Delecini, was indeed the power behind the throne in the early stages. End quote. And we see this corroborated by Alexios' own daughter, the author herself, Anna Komneni. She writes, quote, "It was his desire that his mother should govern rather than himself." End quote. But see, Alexios didn't say a single word of this out loud to nobody in fear that his mother would leave the palace. See, his mother, Anna, really was the devout lady mentioned in previous episodes, and she was just about ready to head to a nunnery and focus on her eternal soul until the end of her days, having seen her sons to greatness. But Alexios needed her. In fact, next to his older brother Isaac, she was his closest advisor and confidant. Anna tells us this. She also writes, quote, "On occasions, he even declared openly that without her brains and good judgment, the empire would not survive." End quote. Well, we're talking about a woman who, without her husband and oldest son, has, up to this point, completely given her life to the betterment of the 4 sons she has left. As for Alexios specifically, she wasn't about to just abandon him when he sought out her advice more than ever before. Anna writes, quote, "Despite this longing in her heart, despite the total preoccupation with the higher life, she also loved her son to a quite exceptional degree and wished somehow to bear with him the storms that buffeted the empire. She desired to guide the ship of state on the best possible course, in fair weather or in tempest, when waves crashed onto it from all sides, especially since the young man had only just taken his seat in the stern and put his hand to the tiller, with no previous experience of storms, winds, and waves of such violence." End quote. Anna Komneni tells us in no uncertain terms that Alexios I gave his mother, Anna Delegation, quote-unquote, the whole executive power, and even put it down in an official imperial chrysible at one point. And we have that chrysible thanks to Anna's chronicle. It reads, quote, "When danger is foreseen, or some other dreadful occurrence is expected, there is no safeguard stronger than a mother who is understanding and loves her son. For if she gives counsel, her advice will be reliable. If she offers prayers, they will confer strength and certain protection. Such at any rate has been the experience of myself, your emperor, in the case of my own revered mother, who has taught and guided and sustained me throughout, from my earliest years. She had a place in the Senate in her own right, after all, but her first concern was for her son, and his faith in her was preserved intact. It was well known that one soul animated us, physically separated though we were, and by the grace of Christ that happy state has persisted to this day. Never were those cold words, mine and yours, uttered between us. And what was even more important, the prayers she poured out during all that time reached the ears of the Lord and have raised me now to the imperial throne." End quote.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso and Samra Origins by the Weekend Coffee Collection.
Introducing Samra Origins. My collaboration with Nespresso is a connection to my roots, to my mother, Samra. Coffee that hits the right notes. It transports you. Crafted with unique notes and bold, soaring flavors. Experience a taste that moves you. Nespresso and Samra Origins.
Discover more at Nespresso.com.
No one should have to choose between their own safety and their pets. But nearly half of domestic abuse survivors delay leaving because they can't bring their pets with them. Purina is helping to create more pet-friendly domestic violence shelters through the Purple Leash Project, so survivors and their pets can escape and heal together. Visit Purina.com/purple to learn more.
So this was just the opening paragraph of this official statement from Emperor Alexios I. Now, it's easy to make jokes about Alexios being a massive, mama's boy, but between his own successes far from her on some random battlefield to her own status among the nobility as a rather sharp mind, even among senators, it's clear the modern stigma of weakness and overprotectiveness that clips a man's wings are simply not there. The closest we get to such an accusation was in 1071, when she explicitly refused to allow Alexios, then only a teenager, to join Emperor Romanus IV on his way out to Manzikert, Seems to me that she nailed that decision to keep Alexios in the capital for safety. Now from here, I'll skip a bit as the whole crucible's pretty long, and it's kind of a lot like that at the beginning. Much of the beginning is really just setting up his mother for some declaration at the end. But the crucible continues with this, quote, "But now I am prepared with God's help to do battle against Rome's enemies. An army is being recruited carefully and thoroughly equipped," end quote. Well, what could he be referring to with this detail about an army currently being built to attack Eastern Rome? Well, if your guess was some random Norman, you are right, but this random Norman is, of course, Robert Guiscard. Now back to the crucible. Quote, "Nevertheless, I do not fail to recognize the importance of civil and political affairs. Fortunately, an impregnable bulwark for good government has been found. In the appointment of my revered mother, of all women most honored, as controller of the entire administration. I, your emperor, therefore decree explicitly in this present crucible the following. Because of her vast experience of secular affairs, and notwithstanding the very low value she sets upon such matters, whatever she decrees in writing shall have the permanent validity as if I myself, your serene emperor, had issued them, or after dictating them, had had them committed to writing. Whatever orders are made by her, written or unwritten, reasonable or unreasonable, provided that they bear her seal, shall be regarded as coming from myself," end quote. So basically, Anna Delecini was only missing a diadem of her own, right? Then the crucible lists all of her duties, specifically, just in case there was any doubt in what he was saying. Promotions, appointments, honors, donations. If she does any of these things, then they shall be honored when Alexios returned from wherever he went, and even after his reign, in perpetuity. Also, she could increase salaries, give gifts of land and wealth and titles, and reduce or increase taxes. To be crystal clear, quote unquote, from the crucible, her words and her decisions shall be reckoned as my own. Anna Komneni writes the following, quote, "I can sum up the whole situation thus. He was in theory the emperor, but she had the real power. She was the legislator, the complete organizer and governor, while he confirmed her arrangements, written and unwritten, the former by his signature, the latter by his spoken approval. One might say that he was indeed the instrument of her power," end quote. And that's coming from the daughter of the emperor. But it makes sense in a way. Alexios had hardly gotten the empire under control. Sure, the capital of Constantinople was getting back on its feet, and word of his humility and penance did wonders in the public image. But this didn't stop the Seljuk Turks, for instance, from needling his eastern borders. And it didn't stop the likes of Robert Guiscard from preparing a massive army to invade the Balkans on some, crazy charges against Eastern Rome. Running an empire was hard work, and Alexios simply played to the strengths of his innermost circle. What's wrong with that? As Anna writes, quote, "My grandmother," and she's talking about Anna Delecini, remember, she says, "My grandmother had an exceptional grasp of public affairs with a genius for organization and government," end quote. While, she continues, quote, "Once my father had seized power, he reserved for himself the struggles and hard labor of war," end quote. Great leaders don't try to do it all him or herself. Great leaders delegate. They play to their subordinates' strengths. Why cheat yourself out of someone else's strengths? So, with the administrative side of the empire presumably in very good hands, let's shift our focus, as did Alexios, to the military matters wreaking havoc around the empire. Those rumors of the Norman Duke, Robert Guiscard, building an invasion army were, by May of 1081, within a few weeks of Alexios Komnenos taking the crown, they were now confirmed. Robert Guiscard's illegitimate son, a young warrior named Bohemond, had already crossed toward Corfu, and things immediately took a turn for the worse for Eastern Rome. And it started with some of those changes in the military and political structures that accompany each change in regime. namely the nearby Byzantine stronghold of Durazzo, or as it was known for centuries before, Dyrrhachium. This city was the capital of the Byzantine region called Illyrium, or as I've also seen it, Illyricon. A Bataniates appointee, as Carr calls him, named George Monomakatos, was currently ruling there, and he was doing nothing to help the Byzantine cause, as the Normans were either threatening or actually making their way over across the Adriatic. Alexios I needed to intervene. He needed to do something. Carr nails it when he writes, quote, "But with what?" He had no more than 300 available soldiers in the capital, all green troops. There were many more experienced men guarding the eastern forts and frontiers, but they would take many days to switch to the western front, even if summoned by the swiftest messengers. Letters were dispatched to the fort commanders, ordering them to report to the capital at once with as many experienced soldiers as they could muster, without denuding their own defenses, end quote. In addition to these troops, Alexios dispatched his brother-in-law, the hero of the hour during the usurpation when he essentially stole the bulk of the Eastern Roman navy and defied his own father publicly by supporting Alexius's bid for the crown. This is, of course, Georgios Palaiologos. Alexios sent Palaiologos to Dyrrhachium to boot Monomakatos and add a little strength to the city's defenses. At the exact same time, this being, again, May of 1081, just a month or so after Alexios became emperor, he received word from these same fort commanders in the east that the Turks were once again on the move. While he gathered up the necessities and men to head out east, fully trusting Georgios Palaiologos with Durazzo, he sent letters to Germany. Yeah, that came out of nowhere. He sent letters to Germany. See, Alexios was always clever, and he knew the recent situation between King Henry IV of Germany and Pope Gregory VII in Rome, as well as the basics of what had occurred at Canossa a few years back. Well, he was ready to play this card in an effort to keep Guiscard at bay for as long as possible. Carr quotes from this letter to Henry IV, quote, "Most noble and truly Christian brother, I pray that your mighty realm may flourish and enjoy even greater prosperity," end quote. It was all crap Alexios was spouting, as the Byzantines were still bitter that Charlemagne, back in 800, was named another Roman emperor. The Byzantines were very protective of that title, and they resented anybody holding it or who had aspirations of holding it that weren't Greek. Suffice it to say that if you were a German king, then you naturally held such aspirations. However, Alexios couldn't afford to be prideful about his title as Emperor of the Romans. Not right now. He needed Guiscard delayed, and Henry IV could be the one to deliver. It was a 700-word letter, Carr tells us, and it painted Robert Guiscard in a horrible light, calling him, quote-unquote, that most iniquitous of men, murderer and criminal. In addition to the letter, Alexios promised 250,000 gold pieces and 100 purple silks should Henry IV intervene on his behalf and draw Guiscard back to the peninsula. And to sweeten the deal, Alexios offered his nephew, Isaac Komnenos and Irene of Alania's son, who, again, Irene of Alania was a cousin of Princess Maria of Georgia, who became Empress Maria before, remember. Well, Alexios offered this boy to Henry IV's family for a betrothal, which would connect the two imperial houses, thus connecting the two long-separated Roman empires. That was huge. That was a big deal. But Alexios always thought about the here and now. In the immortal words of Homer Simpson, that sounds like a problem for future Homer. He could deal with the future when it came, but for now he needed help, and he was willing to do whatever it took to overcome the obstacle. Now, trusting that Henry IV, or anybody for that matter, would be an absolute fool to pass up this offer, he trusted that, despite Guiscard currently making his way across the Adriatic, he was now freed up to face eastward, just for a short amount of time at least. However, the next few weeks, Alexios created what Carr refers to as, quote-unquote, hit-and-run commando groups, with which Alexios orchestrated, quote-unquote, nighttime boat raids against Turkish camps. But Alexios was doing more than that when he was choosing to fight the Turks in the east before heading off to Guiscard. Alexios knew that he had so very few troops, and the ones he had were new recruits with little to no experience in battle. This would not suffice when he made his way west. Alexios devised a plan to deal with the Seljuk Turks while training a brand new army. It was a stroke of genius. Alexios made a fresh round of appointments for his new experienced warriors to be elevated to commanders of groups of 10 men apiece. The new recruits were given shields and bows, while the ones with little experience were given helmets, shields, and spears, says Anna Komneni. She writes, quote, "They were ordered to make their way secretly at night round the headlands offshore, and then, if they were sure the enemy did not greatly outnumber them, to leap from their ships and raid the Turks. They were then to re-embark and return to base at once." End quote. Alexios' plan was to slowly introduce the new recruits to bits and pieces of warfare, let them see death and battle in small increments so as to acclimate them to the horrors of larger warfare. Anna continued, quote, "After these tactics had been repeated for some days, the barbarians withdrew from the coast, little by little. When the emperor saw what was happening, he ordered his men to seize the village and buildings the enemy had formerly occupied and stay there during the night. About sunrise, when the others normally went out to forage, or for some other necessary reason, they were to make a sudden attack on them, and if they met with any success, however small, to be content with it." End quote. When the Turks had had enough a second time and retreated further back, Alexios changed tactics. All those equipped with helmets, shields, and spears, the ones who had engaged in numerous small hand-to-hand skirmishes, well, they were all given horses to mount and train with. The training with a horse, and now a lance instead of a spear, created an experienced group of cavalrymen who were sent in to these small Turkish camps to run the aforementioned lightning raids. However, these were no longer in the dark of the night, but in the middle of the day. Anna writes that at that point, quote, "Those who had been commanding 10 men found themselves commanders of units of 50 men. So it came about that while things went badly for the Turks, the hidden spark of Roman prestige began gradually to burst into flame." End quote. These tactics created an army that became capable and confident in a matter of weeks, and Alexios quite literally built it from scratch in record time. He had not only swelled his numbers, but he had built a strong scaffolding of experienced officers with which to command this new army, while also pushing back the immediate eastern threat. They were so devastating, these lightning raids, that Alexios was able to force the Sultan of Rum to come to the peace table. The Turks, in a matter of 3 weeks, had been pushed far away from the Bosporus, out of the port of Kyzikos, and out of the districts such as Bithynia, Thynia, and Nicomedia, all with an army that started out consisting largely of young soldiers who had never seen a single image of violence or warfare. By mid-May, Alexios I had a brand new army on his hands. With the Turks in the east once again quelled, Alexios was forced to turn his attention back to the west, back to Robert Guiscard. And this is where we will cut off this episode, as what happens next will be on the public episode 134, when we finally see the clash between two of the greatest leaders in late 11th century Europe, Robert Guiscard and Alexios I Komnenos. Thank you for all your support. Until next time.